March 10th, 1944. Mid-Atlantic, 800 miles west of the Azores, Kapitänleutnant Heinz Weber stood in the conning tower of U-515, scanning the horizon through Zeiss binoculars that had served him faithfully through 17 combat patrols. The morning sun glinted off gentle swells that stretched endlessly in every direction. Empty ocean, safe ocean, or so he thought. Weber commanded one of Germany's most successful submarines, credited with sinking over 50,000 tons of Allied shipping. His Iron Cross First Class testified to his skill at the deadly game of convoy hunting. He understood the rhythm of the Atlantic, the patterns of Allied convoys, the areas where hunting was profitable versus those where escorts made attacks too risky. Today, positioned along a known convoy route, he waited with the patience of a predator who knew his prey would eventually arrive. What Weber didn't know, what no U-boat commander yet fully understood, was that the rules had fundamentally changed. The ocean he thought he knew had become something entirely different. The Americans had created a new type of naval formation specifically designed to hunt submarines, not to defend convoys, not to react to attacks, but to proactively seek out and destroy U-boats in their own hunting grounds. They called them hunter-killer groups. At that moment, 40 miles to the northwest, the USS Guadalcanal, a small escort carrier displacing just 7,800 tons, steamed in the center of a circular screen of 5 destroyer escorts. Commander Daniel Gallery, a Chicago native with an aggressive tactical mind, had been hunting U-515 for 3 days. His aircraft had detected a diesel exhaust plume the previous evening. His destroyers had picked up hydrophone contacts during the night. Gallery knew a U-boat was nearby, and unlike convoy escorts who would be focused on protecting merchant ships, his entire task group had one mission: find that submarine and kill it. The transformation of the Battle of the Atlantic from defensive convoy protection to offensive submarine hunting represented one of the most significant tactical evolutions of World War II. For U-boat commanders accustomed to hunting convoys like wolves stalking sheep, the appearance of dedicated hunter groups reversed the predator-prey relationship with devastating psychological and material effects. The vast Atlantic that had seemed to offer unlimited hunting grounds and routes of escape was becoming a death trap where German submarines were themselves the hunted. The story of how America developed and deployed these hunter-killer groups involves technological innovation, tactical revolution, and industrial capacity operating at scales that German naval planners had never imagined possible. It begins not with carriers and destroyers, but with a crisis that threatened to lose the war before American armies could even reach Europe. In 1942, German U-boats were winning the Battle of the Atlantic. Admiral Dönitz, commanding the U-boat arm, had refined wolfpack tactics to devastating effect. Groups of submarines coordinated attacks on Allied convoys, overwhelming escorts and sinking merchant ships faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. The statistics told a grim story. In 1942, U-boats sank 1,160 Allied ships, totaling over 6 million tons. That same year, the Allies built only 7.1 million tons of new shipping. The margin was catastrophically thin. The mathematics of submarine warfare favored the Germans. The Atlantic Ocean covered roughly 32 million square miles. A surfaced U-boat presented a profile less than 100 feet long and perhaps 20 feet high, a tiny target in an enormous expanse. Submerged, it became essentially invisible to surface ships beyond a few thousand yards. A single U-boat could threaten an entire convoy. Escorts had to protect every merchant ship. The submarine needed only one successful attack. Dönitz calculated that if he could maintain 300 operational U-boats at sea simultaneously, he could sink ships faster than the Allies could build them, severing Britain's maritime lifeline and making an invasion of Europe impossible. In early 1943, the crisis reached its peak. In March alone, U-boats sank 108 Allied ships totaling 627,000 tons, the highest monthly total of the war. Convoy SC-122 and HX-229, sailing together, lost 21 ships to wolfpack attacks. The Admiralty in London calculated that at current loss rates, Britain would run out of fuel, food, and raw materials within 6 months. Winston Churchill would later write that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. The traditional response to submarine attack was convoy escort, concentrating merchant ships into groups protected by destroyers, corvettes, and frigates. This defensive strategy reduced losses but didn't solve the fundamental problem. Escorts could only react to attacks. They defended convoys but rarely destroyed submarines. A U-boat commander who exercised patience and caution could usually escape after attacking. The ocean was simply too vast, and submarines too difficult to locate and kill. American naval planners, studying the problem with fresh eyes, recognized a fundamental truth. You couldn't win a war purely through defense. At some point you had to take the offensive. Rather than waiting for U-boats to attack convoys, why not hunt them down in their operational areas? The concept was simple, but implementation required technology and resources that hadn't existed in sufficient quantities until American industrial production reached full scale. The key technological enabler was the escort carrier, known in the US Navy as CVE, which sailors joked stood for combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. These small carriers, typically converted from merchant ship hulls, displaced between 7,000 and 11,000 tons, compared to the 27,000 tons of fleet carriers like Enterprise or Yorktown. They carried between 20 and 28 aircraft, mostly Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters. Their maximum speed of 19 knots meant they couldn't keep pace with fast carrier task forces. But for anti-submarine warfare, these limitations didn't matter. Escort carriers were perfect for hunting U-boats. They could operate in the mid-Atlantic where land-based aircraft couldn't reach. Their aircraft could search vast areas of ocean, covering in hours what surface ships would need days to scout. Their deck crews could launch and recover aircraft in the North Atlantic's brutal weather conditions. And most importantly, American shipyards could build them quickly and in quantity. The Kaiser Shipbuilding Company in Vancouver, Washington, perfected the art of rapid escort carrier construction. Using prefabricated sections and assembly line techniques borrowed from automotive manufacturing, Kaiser yards could complete an escort carrier in as little as 3 months. By contrast, fleet carriers required 2 to 3 years to build. This industrial capacity meant that America could produce escort carriers faster than Germany could sink them, creating a sustainable asset for offensive anti-submarine operations. The first dedicated hunter-killer group, built around the escort carrier USS Bogue, became operational in March 1943. Captain Giles Short, commanding Bogue, understood that his mission differed fundamentally from fleet carrier operations. His aircraft wouldn't be attacking enemy warships or supporting amphibious landings. They would be hunting submarines, a prey that could dive beneath the surface and disappear, that left minimal visual traces, and that could only be detected through careful observation and persistent searching. The Avenger aircraft proved ideal for submarine hunting. With a crew of 3, pilot, radioman gunner, and bombardier, the Avenger could stay airborne for up to 7 hours while carrying depth charges, acoustic homing torpedoes, or bombs. It cruised at 145 miles per hour, slow enough to carefully search ocean surfaces for the telltale signs of submarine presence. The periscope wake that trailed behind a submarine at periscope depth, the swirl of disturbed water where a submarine had just dived, the oil slick from a diesel exhaust, the shadow of a submerged hull in clear water. Avenger crews developed extraordinary skill at submarine detection. They learned that surfaced U-boats appeared as small, dark slivers against the ocean, almost invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. They discovered that binoculars were often more effective than naked eye scanning because they reduced the field of view, allowing the eye to focus on smaller areas more carefully. They realized that low-angle sunlight created shadows that made submerged submarines visible down to depths of 50 feet in clear water. The tactics evolved rapidly through brutal trial and error. Early attacks often failed because aircraft dropped depth charges from too high an altitude, giving submarines time to dive deep and escape the explosion radius. Experienced pilots learned to descend to just 50 feet above the water before releasing weapons, minimizing the submarine's escape window. They discovered that approaching from the submarine's stern was most effective because U-boat lookouts focused their attention forward and to the sides, creating a blind spot that attacking aircraft could exploit. The destroyer escorts that screened the escort carriers were equally critical to hunter-killer group effectiveness. These ships, designated D in US Navy terminology, were smaller and cheaper than fleet destroyers, but perfect for anti-submarine work. Displacing around 1,400 tons with a crew of 200, destroyer escorts carried sonar equipment for detecting submerged submarines, depth charge racks for attacking them, and the endurance to maintain contact for hours while the submarine crew exhausted themselves trying to escape. The key innovation in destroyer escort operations was the concept of persistent prosecution. Traditional convoy escorts had to abandon submarine contacts to maintain position with their convoy. Destroyer escorts in hunter-killer groups could pursue a submarine contact indefinitely. Once sonar established contact, the destroyer escort would dog the submarine relentlessly, attacking with depth charges every time the submarine came within range, preventing it from surfacing to recharge batteries, forcing it to maneuver continuously underwater until battery power was exhausted. U-boat commanders called this tactic the treatment, and they feared it above all else. A submarine forced to remain submerged while under continuous sonar tracking faced a mathematical death sentence. Battery power, the submarine's lifeblood when underwater, drained with every hour. The air inside the pressure hull became increasingly foul as carbon dioxide built up. The crew, unable to cook or use sanitation facilities while under attack, gradually descended into exhaustion and despair. Eventually, the submarine would have to surface, and when it did, the destroyer escorts would be waiting. The first major success of the hunter-killer concept came in April 1943, when Bogue's aircraft sank U-175 in the mid-Atlantic. The kill demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated air and surface attack. An Avenger spotted U-175's periscope and attacked with depth charges, forcing the submarine to surface. Destroyer escorts moved in immediately, engaging with gunfire and ramming. The submarine sank with the loss of 11 crew, while 41 survivors were rescued. The attack, from initial detection to final sinking, took less than 3 hours, a remarkably short time compared to the day-long convoy battles that had characterized earlier anti-submarine operations. More hunter-killer groups formed throughout 1943 and 1944. Each group typically consisted of 1 escort carrier and 3 to 5 destroyer escorts operating as an independent task force. Unlike convoy escorts tied to merchant ships, these groups roamed freely across the Atlantic, positioning themselves in areas where intelligence indicated U-boat concentrations. They operated with aggressive tactics that would have been impossible for convoy escorts, deliberately entering U-boat patrol zones and daring the submarines to attack. The intelligence aspect proved crucial. By 1943, Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park were regularly reading German naval Enigma traffic. This allowed the Allies to know where U-boats were operating, where they were being directed to form patrol lines, and when and where they would rendezvous with supply submarines known as milk cows. Hunter-killer groups could be positioned along U-boat transit routes or near patrol areas, dramatically increasing the probability of contact. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was devastating. German submariners had grown accustomed to being the hunters, the predators who struck from the depths with impunity. The appearance of hunter-killer groups reversed this relationship in ways that shattered the fundamental assumptions that had sustained U-boat morale. Suddenly, mid-ocean positions that had seemed safe became death traps. Areas far from convoy routes where submarines had surfaced freely to recharge batteries became hunting grounds where aircraft appeared without warning. Kapitänleutnant Wolfgang Luth, one of Germany's most successful U-boat commanders with over 220,000 tons of shipping sunk, described the transformation in a report to Dönitz. The American escort carriers have changed everything. We can no longer surface safely even in remote ocean areas. Their aircraft appear without warning. We are forced to remain submerged for extended periods, unable to recharge batteries or ventilate the boat. The crew exhaustion becomes critical after just 3 days of this treatment. Most dangerous is the psychological effect. The men feel hunted constantly. They know the Americans are looking specifically for us, not just protecting convoys. This changes the nature of the war at sea. The statistics reflected this transformation. In May 1943, the same month the first hunter-killer groups became fully operational, U-boat losses spiked dramatically. The Germans lost 43 submarines, more than in any previous month of the war. This represented roughly 25% of the operational U-boat fleet, destroyed in just 31 days. The loss rate, which had averaged around 10 submarines per month in 1942, had more than quadrupled. Dönitz, recognizing the crisis, temporarily withdrew U-boats from the North Atlantic in June 1943. For the first time since the war began, no wolfpacks operated against Allied convoys in the main convoy routes. The Admiral needed time to reassess tactics, to develop countermeasures against the new Allied capabilities, and to rebuild his shattered force. But the withdrawal itself demonstrated that the fundamental balance of power in the Atlantic had shifted irreversibly. The summer of 1943 saw a dramatic expansion of the hunter-killer concept. By August, 8 American escort carrier groups operated in the Atlantic, each hunting submarines as its primary mission. The USS Card under Captain Arnold Burdick sank 5 U-boats in a single 2-month patrol, a feat unprecedented in anti-submarine warfare. The USS Cause aircraft destroyed 4 submarines during a July patrol. The USS Santee damaged 3 U-boats so severely they had to return to base for repairs, effectively removing them from combat for months. The Germans attempted countermeasures. U-boats were equipped with additional anti-aircraft guns, typically twin or quadruple 20mm cannon mounts, to fight off attacking aircraft. Dönitz ordered boats to remain surfaced and fight rather than dive, hoping that concentrated flak would drive off Avengers before they could drop depth charges. This tactic proved disastrous. Aircraft were harder to hit than submarine commanders expected, especially Avengers approaching at high speed from the stern quarter. Meanwhile, surface submarines became perfect targets for the heavy guns of destroyer escorts that inevitably accompanied the aircraft. The introduction of acoustic homing torpedoes by the Germans in September 1943 briefly threatened hunter-killer effectiveness. These torpedoes, designated T5 but called Zamkönig or Wren by the Germans, homed on the propeller noise of escort ships. Early attacks achieved some success, damaging several destroyer escorts. But American engineers quickly developed countermeasures. The Foxer, a noise-making device towed behind destroyers, generated sounds that decoyed the acoustic torpedoes away from the ship. More sophisticated versions followed, and within 3 months the acoustic torpedo threat had been largely neutralized. The snorkel, a breathing tube that allowed U-boats to run their diesel engines while submerged just below the surface, represented Germany's most effective countermeasure. Snorkel-equipped boats could remain submerged almost indefinitely, charging batteries and ventilating without fully surfacing. This reduced vulnerability to aircraft attack. But snorkeling created its own problems. The snorkel head created a visible wake at periscope depth. The submarine could only make about 6 knots while snorkeling, far slower than the 18 knots possible on the surface. Engine exhaust sometimes backfired into the hull, causing injuries. Most critically, snorkeling required the submarine to operate at shallow depth where it was vulnerable to sonar detection by surface ships. One of the most spectacular hunter-killer operations occurred in June 1944 when Captain Daniel Gallery's task group, built around USS Guadalcanal, captured U-505 intact. This marked the first enemy warship captured by the US Navy since 1815. Gallery had developed aggressive tactics that emphasized forcing submarines to surface rather than simply sinking them. When his destroyer escort USS Chatelaine detected U-505 by sonar and attacked with Hedgehog projectiles, the submarine surfaced with severe damage. Guadalcanal's aircraft strafed the conning tower to suppress defensive fire, while destroyer escorts closed in. The German crew abandoned ship believing it would sink, but American boarding parties seized the submarine before scuttling charges detonated. The captured Enigma machine and codebooks provided intelligence value, but more importantly, the capture demonstrated the overwhelming superiority that hunter-killer groups had achieved over their prey. The hunter-killer groups operated with a freedom of movement and aggression that convoy escorts could never match. When intelligence indicated a U-boat concentration, entire task groups would converge on the area. Multiple escort carriers with their aircraft could blanket vast ocean areas with continuous patrols. The submarines, forced to remain submerged to avoid detection, lost the mobility that had been their greatest advantage. They became nearly stationary targets, waiting for the inevitable moment when their battery power ran out and they had to surface into the waiting guns of destroyer escorts. The psychological toll on U-boat crews became unbearable. Men who had volunteered for submarine service seeking the aggressive, offensive nature of wolfpack operations found themselves trapped in steel tubes beneath the ocean, hunted by an enemy they rarely saw but constantly feared. The arrival of spring 1944 brought no respite. Hunter-killer groups expanded their operations, now hunting not just in the mid-Atlantic but in the Bay of Biscay approaches to French submarine bases, in the waters around Iceland, and in the Caribbean approaches to the Panama Canal. By mid-1944, the U-boat force that had nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic had been reduced to desperate defense. New submarines still left German and Norwegian ports, but they did so knowing that survival odds had plummeted. The average U-boat operational life, which had been measured in years in 1940, was now measured in months or even weeks. Crew training shortened as losses among experienced submariners mounted. New commanders went on patrol with minimal experience, facing American crews who had refined their tactics through hundreds of successful hunts. The industrial dimension of the hunter-killer campaign was as important as the tactical dimension. American shipyards produced escort carriers so rapidly that losses could be absorbed and replaced without reducing operational strength. The Kaiser Vancouver yard alone completed 50 escort carriers during the war. Tacoma, Seattle, and other Pacific Coast yards built dozens more. Each carrier represented a mobile airfield that could project anti-submarine capability across thousands of miles of ocean. The Germans, by contrast, lost the production race decisively. Every U-boat sunk represented months of construction effort that could never be replaced quickly enough to maintain force strength. The aircraft production disparity was even more dramatic. Grumman produced over 9,800 Avengers during the war. Even with combat losses, there were always more aircraft available than pilots to fly them or carriers to base them on. Germany produced approximately 1,100 U-boats total during the entire war. The mathematics of attrition warfare overwhelmingly favored the Americans. They could lose aircraft and even occasionally carriers and simply replace them. Germany could not replace experienced submarine crews or maintain U-boat numbers against sustained losses exceeding 20 boats per month. The technology gap widened throughout 1944. American aircraft received centimetric radar that could detect submarine periscopes and snorkels at ranges exceeding 10 miles. German radar warning receivers couldn't detect these new frequencies, meaning submarines had no warning that aircraft were approaching until they were already under attack. Acoustic sonobuoys dropped from aircraft could detect submerged submarines and guide destroyers to attack positions. Rocket projectiles carried by aircraft provided a new weapon that was more accurate than depth charges and could be fired from longer range. The German response to these technological advantages proved inadequate. The Type 21 U-boat, with revolutionary streamlined hull design and massive battery capacity, could have changed the tactical balance if deployed in quantity. But production delays, Allied bombing of construction yards, and transportation difficulties meant only a handful became operational before the war ended. The Type 21 represented what German submarine technology could have achieved, but industrial capacity and time had run out. The final phase of the Atlantic campaign saw hunter-killer groups ranging as far as the Arctic Ocean and the South Atlantic. They hunted the supply submarines that refueled operational boats, cutting the logistical chain that allowed U-boats to remain at sea for extended patrols. They interdicted transit routes between Norwegian bases and operational areas, making the journey itself as dangerous as combat operations. They positioned themselves near known U-boat bases, attacking submarines as they departed or returned, when they were most vulnerable because crews were relaxed and defenses were down. One particularly effective tactic involved positioning a hunter-killer group along a known submarine transit route and deliberately sending out misleading radio signals suggesting the presence of an undefended convoy. U-boats attempting to intercept the phantom convoy would find themselves instead encountering a fully alerted task group specifically hunting submarines. This reversal of the ambush tactic that U-boats had used so effectively against convoys demonstrated the complete transformation of Atlantic warfare. The hunters had become the hunted. The statistics of the hunter-killer campaign tell the story of this transformation with brutal clarity. In 1943, the Allies sank 237 German U-boats. In 1944, they sank 241 more. Of these kills, escort carrier task groups accounted for approximately 85 submarines, roughly 20% of all U-boats destroyed during these 2 years. But the indirect impact was far greater. The mere presence of hunter-killer groups forced submarines to operate with extreme caution, reducing their effectiveness even when they weren't directly engaged. U-boats spent more time submerged and less time positioned to attack convoys. They took longer to reach patrol areas because they had to travel submerged through waters where hunter-killer groups operated. Their combat effectiveness declined as exhausted, demoralized crews made mistakes that experienced, confident crews would have avoided. The human cost of the U-boat campaign was catastrophic for Germany. Of approximately 39,000 men who served in U-boats during World War II, approximately 28,000 died in action, a loss rate of 75%. This exceeded the casualties of any other military service in any combatant nation. Entire classes of submarine officer candidates graduated, went to sea, and died without survivors within months. The hunter-killer groups contributed significantly to these losses, not just through direct kills, but through the cumulative effect of continuous hunting pressure that broke crew morale and degraded operational effectiveness. For the Allies, the victory in the Atlantic enabled everything else. Without control of the Atlantic sea lanes, there could have been no build-up of forces in Britain for the invasion of Europe. There could have been no Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviet Union via Arctic convoys. There could have been no sustained strategic bombing campaign, which depended on supplies shipped across the Atlantic. The hunter-killer groups, operating far from public attention, hunting an enemy most people never saw, contributed as much to Allied victory as more celebrated campaigns. The Germans recognized their defeat. Admiral Dönitz, who had believed in 1942 that his U-boats could win the war, admitted in 1944 that the submarine campaign had been lost. The appearance of escort carriers, he wrote in his memoirs, was the most significant development in anti-submarine warfare. It closed the air gap in the mid-Atlantic where our submarines had operated with relative freedom. More importantly, it changed the psychological balance. My crews went from hunters to hunted. Once that transformation occurs, the military effectiveness of a force declines dramatically, regardless of its technical capabilities. The Battle of the Atlantic officially ended on May 8, 1945, with Germany's surrender. On that day, approximately 375 U-boats were still in commission, but they no longer represented a threat. Most were surrendered in port or scuttled by their crews. A few attempted to escape to neutral ports in South America, but were intercepted. The vast fleets of merchant ships that had sustained Britain and supplied the invasion of Europe crossed the Atlantic without loss, a testament to the completeness of Allied victory. The hunter-killer concept revolutionized anti-submarine warfare, establishing principles that remain relevant in modern naval operations. The idea of dedicated offensive groups hunting submarines, rather than waiting to react to attacks, became standard doctrine. The integration of air and surface assets into unified task forces optimized for submarine hunting influenced post-war carrier development. The emphasis on persistent prosecution of contacts until submarines were destroyed or forced to surface established the ruthless efficiency necessary for anti-submarine success. The U-boat crews who survived to witness the introduction of hunter-killer groups experienced a transformation as profound as the strategic shift itself. Men who had gone to sea in 1942 as confident predators hunting Allied shipping returned to port in 1944 as traumatized survivors of an enemy they could rarely fight effectively. The psychological impact of being hunted, of knowing that aircraft could appear without warning, that destroyer escorts would pursue contacts for days if necessary, shattered the aggressive mindset that had made the U-boat force effective. In war, the side that controls the psychological dimension often wins regardless of material factors. The hunter-killer groups seized psychological control of the Atlantic, turning it from a German hunting ground into an Allied kill zone. In the end, the U-boats that had threatened to sever Britain's maritime lifeline and starve the island into submission were themselves hunted to the edge of extinction. The vast Atlantic that Dönitz had believed could never be fully controlled by surface ships proved controllable once America applied its industrial capacity and tactical innovation to the problem. The escort carriers that sailors had mocked as combustible, vulnerable, and expendable became the weapons that won the longest continuous campaign of World War II. The destroyer escorts that had seemed like poor substitutes for fleet destroyers proved perfectly suited for the relentless prosecution of submarine contacts. Together, These unglamorous, underappreciated warships transformed the Atlantic from a German lake into an American ocean, hunted the U-boats to defeat, and ensured that Allied armies would have the supplies they needed to win the war. The hunter-killers had done their job, and done it with devastating effectiveness.